Buenos días, buenas tardes. Es un gusto estar reunidos hoy aquí todos. Sean bienvenidos, Professor Gary. Welcome here. It's a privilege to have you here. Thanks a lot. Simplemente voy a dar unas pequeñas palabras, una breve presentación a la gran trayectoria extensa, profunda del profesor Gary y iniciará el curso, ¿de acuerdo? Liderado por la profesora Correa, por la profesora Girón. Hoy empieza un curso de 3 días. El profesor actualmente está afiliado, es investigador, profesor en Economía Aplicada en la Universidad de Leeds, en Reino Unido. Ha sido profesor en la Universidad de California, visitante en las universidades de Bangladesh, Japón, Grecia, Brasil. Ha estado en México, es un muy buen amigo de México, ha estado aquí en repetidas ocasiones, invitado por nuestra casa de estudios, también por la Universidad Autónoma Metropolitana. Al profesor le gusta mucho la econometría, pero ha ampliado sus campos de investigación. Hoy es especialista reconocido mundialmente en temas de finanzas internacionales, banca, regulación, un poco de gobernanza. Se ha metido temas de ciudades y sociedades sustentables. Tiene una gran obra publicada y también es miembro del comité de reputadas revistas, y aquí un anuncio, también ha contribuido a la revista electrónica o la financiera, y esperamos que también muy pronto a Investigación Económica. Bueno, les deseo mucho éxito, espero que lo aprovechen. Es un privilegio contar con un profesor que nos viene a impartir un gusto, con toda su energía, con todo su conocimiento, con toda su pasión. Profesor, muchísimas gracias. Sea usted muy bienvenido, nos veremos pronto por aquí. Los dejo entonces con la profesora Correa y con la profesora Girón. Gracias.
Bueno, muchas gracias a todos ustedes. Solamente quiero agradecer todo el apoyo que hemos tenido a la facultad y al instituto para hacer esta conferencia, y por supuesto a todos ustedes bienvenidos. Espero que sea un curso que sea muy útil. Sí me gustaría recordarles que hoy a las 7 de la noche en la Facultad de Contaduría el doctor va a impartir una conferencia donde estaremos de comentaristas el doctor Julio Castellanos y yo misma, sobre los grandes bancos y la regulación, los grandes bancos globales y la regulación. Entonces, si quieren, nos vemos allá en el posgrado de Contaduría, en el auditorio, a las 7 de la noche. Entonces, vamos a dar inicio al curso. La dinámica va a ser la siguiente: el profesor va a dar su conferencia. Después va a hacer una pausa pues para tomar, qué sé yo, un poco de café, y ustedes preparan sus preguntas para que el profesor pueda ir contestando cada una de sus preguntas, cada una de sus ideas. Entonces, pues, y ahí le vamos a pedir a la doctora Alicia Girón que el día de hoy sea la moderadora de esta sesión. Gracias a todos por estar aquí con nosotros hoy.
Buenas tardes. It's a pleasure to be here and to have a chance to really present some ideas. Often when we go to a place, we only have a few minutes to present ideas. This is going to be different, and I really welcome the chance. For years I've been working on a kind of Keynesian, kind of Marxian, kind of institutionalist approach, kind of Kaletskian, really finding my way, trying to put the pieces together of a vision of what I had to say about the U.S. economy, the global economy, the developing economies. And the ideas have maybe finally come together. This summer, I had a plan to make a book. And actually, it wasn't possible, and the reason was that I was asked by my colleagues in England to lead a very large project about rethinking macroeconomics. And it would be a 4-year project to involve many, many economists, and actually it could be all over the world, to try to make a new macroeconomic theory. And so actually I put aside the idea of the book, and I worked day and night on this project. We are almost at the end. We don't know if we will succeed, but all of the progressive economists in the UK have come together, and we are doing our best so that we can join the kind of anti-austerity program and put a different macro so that we can get out of this global stagnation. So in some sense, you know, Eugenia made this title, and I thought, wow, okay, thank you. This is something. And then I just added, we need a new global model, because we need a new global model. We do. And you know, we have to think holistically. And so let's just simplify the title. Is this a new Great Depression? And you know, and if we look at this, you know, and just take a look, we have, first of all, emerging market crisis and commodity price collapse. But this is not the first time, you know, and we have now, like, Europe with their Japanese problem. Of course, before that, and then we have the, you know, at the center of the world economy, we have China and the US, each in very complicated ways of turning inward. But, you know, before Europe had a Japanese problem, Japan had a Japanese problem. So we can add that to the picture. And then actually, you know, if we want to add in, so I was kind of taking apart Eugenia's title and just playing with the elements. How do we make sense of this? And actually it was helping me to think, because back in the 1980s, we already had the coming of the economics of neoliberalism, and right away we had the first commodity crash and emerging market crisis. In fact, we're in the Herzog Auditorium, so here we are. And actually, that had something to do with denial about the economics of the Great Depression. But then we came out of that, and we now have the economics of global financialization, and it leads us again to this crisis of commodity price collapse and emerging markets in terrible crisis. I just came from Brazil. It's awful, actually, Brazil right now. So, you know, when we look at this, we realize that the story I'm going to tell you in these 3 days is, first of all, the story about the logic of economics of three kinds, three periods. The economics of the Great Depression and the lessons that were learned and the battles that were fought, especially between the Keynesians and the classicals. Then we'll turn to what happened after that world that they made, the Bretton Woods world, ended. Then we'll look at the economics of financial globalization. So we'll do these things step by step. And let's see if there's, oh, I'm hitting the wrong, sorry about that. And then actually, we now are in this new phase, the economics of global austerity. This is the phase since the so-called global crisis of 2008, 2010. And now we have to ask, as, for example, Paul Krugman and Larry Summers and other people are asking, is this a depression? And in order to do this, what we have to do, so this is the economics, but then we have to put on top of this, as another layer, we have to put the kind of logic, the geopolitical and political economic logic of the global system. And that means that, first of all, we start with the contradictory logic of Bretton Woods system. That leads us to the contradictory logic of the neoliberal era, which I call post-hegemonic hegemony. And finally, that takes us to this new phase, which is this logic right now, I think, unsustainable. Post-hegemonic, market-driven capitalism. It's not going to work. We need a new model. So we're going to go, in some sense, we're going to look at the economics, and then we're going to look at the interplay with the global power. And you'll see that, you know, everyone is, maybe you're used to, if you listen to me before, you know that I like to talk about finance and banking. Banking is all in the middle of all of that, but that's the structure we need to understand what's happening. So these are the topics we're going to cover in the next days, and we're going to do these ones first. So we'll just take pieces. So don't worry, it'll all come naturally. And we can organize things in some way if you're interested. But we're going to start with, here's our first one. We're going to start with the basic macro logic, and then we'll introduce the Bretton Woods system and talk about its contradiction. The contradiction in Bretton Woods remains present today, and it remains a problem at each moment in our global world as we have it. Oh, let me do this. To discipline, I forgot to start. Let's do that. Okay. Then we're going to talk about we're going to add into, when we think about the contradictions, we got to take a journey through cross-border balances and imbalances to make sure we understand that context. Then we'll get into basically the way that the financial markets have reacted to the breakdown, to the end of Bretton Woods, and that will bring us to Dymski. Then we'll talk about, how we ended with the neoliberal era, and then we'll put Dymski's theory into kind of historical context, because essentially Dymski's theory of crisis was a very soft, in a certain way, soft theory of crisis, where you could take some simple actions and everything would be solved. But it didn't end that way, and that's going to be the end of our discussion today. Okay. So we were, this particular lecture, much of it is taken from some slides I made for Bangalore, and I had some chance to speak there. And Professor Amit Baduri was there, and we had some chance to discuss a lot. And so I just left this here in honor of him. He was talking, he's inspired by Koletsky. And, Koletsky's ideas are very important, I think, if we make a theory of, if we want to discuss about global capitalist reproduction, because Koletsky allows us to bring in Marx and to bring in Keynes. We get it all in one kind of integrated package. And this is something that we can then use to understand very clearly the systemic patterns that are at work. Now, if we look at classical and Keynesian macro logics then, we have this battle right from the beginning of political economy between the kind of theories of Adam Smith, market-driven, everyone can grow by becoming selfish, and autonomous growth and creativity. And on the other hand, theories of crisis, that this system, as it works together, will not work well. And the idea, that the core idea of this kind of classical theories of value and distribution, especially as interpreted by Maurice Dobb, is that the problem of distribution is always there, and it's a social question. It's a social and political question. And so if we deny that there is a social and political aspect to distribution, if we pretend the markets take care of everything, that means if the states, if the governments pay no attention to the distribution of wealth, the distribution of capabilities, the distribution of happiness, of income, then there's a denial of the foundation of actual society itself. The state steps back and says it has no responsibility, but actually that's a formula for the destruction of that state and of that society. And of course that's why we're going to come to the end of this story and see that that's where we are, and we cannot stay there. And so basically this is something that we see happening, and that's why, as I mentioned here, in Dobb's book, he has a subtitle, Ideology and Economic Theory. There's the things we see and the things that we make invisible. And we have to be aware of that as we build a theory of what's happening. Okay. So, three economists, Jevons, Walras, and Menger, invent the marginal revolution, and they base economic value on utility theory. The whole configuration of economic relations, they derive from preferences, endowments, technology. Wages that are somehow coming out of the application of technology to the labor process. It's an equilibrium. the distribution of income in that vision is technologically determined, not socially given. And Marshall kind of goes along with this and writes this 1890 textbook. He writes it and writes it again and again and again, in I think 7 editions, The Principles of Economics. Now here's where, so this is the frame, this is the thing that replaces the classical vision. So we have this contrast between a vision of society that makes visible, that makes it clear that the distribution of income, wealth, and happiness is a social and political problem, and it's immediately countered by this other vision that says, no, it's all technological, and anything that is moving in this society other than technological change is individual preference. So the state is not even there. This problem, this conflict between the state must be there and the state is completely absent, this conflict remains to this very day in theories of economic equilibrium, especially, and disequilibrium, especially in contemporary macroeconomics. And so we have that here. Keynes, you know, when he enters the scene, he's a student of Marshall, and he makes some mischief. He plays the kind of devil because, you know, he discovers, and Koletsky discovers, the principle of aggregate demand, something about the relationship between external stimulus to the economy and the logic of economic reproduction that wasn't exactly known before. He brings it out, and it becomes a very powerful tool for taking on, as it turns out, the problem of depression. But as he formulates this idea, his mischief, his devil work, is he says, well, the people who are a problem are the classical economists. And basically he says, so they're the classical ones. He means Marshall. Marshall, in turn, is channeling Jevons and the other, and Walras and so on, those economists. And so it's a confusion, because what he does is he disappears Marx, Ricardo, Smith from the landscape. They become invisible. I recently reread some of his work, and he makes this discussion, well, it all came to this, but he knows what he's doing. He has little time for Marx. And so basically, he takes the material basis of production, which is what we see in Marx, and we see it visibly in Koletsky. Think of Koletsky's model, you know, capitalist workers. Right there, at the heart of it, you have this conflict in this production process, and he invisibilizes that. It turns into aggregate demand. And he invisibilizes as well the social basis of wage setting. So this is something where we see this, things become fractionalized, things break up. We see Keynesians that completely ignore Marx, that completely ignore power, problems of distribution, and we see Marxians and others who completely ignore problems of aggregate demand. So we have these kind of really difficult problems of communication among economists, and these problems, of course, come from these confusions that were part of solving the puzzle of what to do in the Great Depression. Now, this term classical stays with us, though. Friedman uses this term, and then with the 1970s, we have these people. You know the names: Lucas, Sargent, Wallace, Prescott, Barrow, the so-called new classical economics. So they take this badge and they put it on themselves, and they adopt that. And indeed, they go right back to the vision that the economy is a general equilibrium, best seen as that, in which everything is disciplined by preferences, endowments, technology. In fact, in a famous phrase, Roger Farmer, in the introduction to his book, The Macroeconomics of Self-Fulfilling Prophecies, he writes, "The future of macroeconomics is as a branch of applied general equilibrium theory." The idea was that there was such a dominance of this view, this reasserted classical view, that comes back and takes the stage from the Keynesian view, that there's nothing to talk about anymore. And so, you know, if we want to have anything like that, then, you know, well, and if we want to have anything Keynesian, and Keynesian now becomes not the alternative vision in which the flow of aggregate demand, the overall scale of the economy, the intervention of the state is what provides the rationale for the intervention of the state, and the fact that in turn supported by the fact that the distribution of income, the level of income, depends on state action. It's a social and political problem. That part is erased. And instead we have this kind of semi-rebirth of something like Keynesianism, but it's the so-called new Keynesian stuff. If you have transaction costs, if there's information that's missing, if there are other problems, then you move away from a first best equilibrium to a second best. And if you're lucky, you can think of something that makes things a little bit better. Maybe it's more stable. But you know, what we never see is the independent role of aggregate demand. We never again see the distribution of income. And we never again see the problem of fundamental uncertainty that we're going to talk about with Keynes. So we have these new Keynesians, and they include many very smart people, Stiglitz, Krugman, and others. But it's very hard for them to challenge the supremacy of general equilibrium theory, because their core ideas are deviations from general equilibrium. It's just, you know, that's a first best, and then you have a second best. You know where you are by thinking of an impossible equilibrium based on a timeless economic theory for an economy that can never exist. But that's your point of reference. That's what you think you're talking about. It poisons the mind because you are somewhere off of planet Earth and then you're reaching for something, but you're not going to get there because you have no strong foundation for your thinking. This is what has to then be confronted as we try to find a new economic model. We have to come back to the earth, back to the foundations, back to the soil, and back to the fact that there is a material basis and a political and social basis for who we are, how we distribute things, how we treat each other, how we pay each other, what we take from each other in economic exchanges all over the world. So, just going to go through, and I'm going to be very brief here. If you're interested in the mathematics, we can talk later. But this is something where it's possible to set up a model that's a very simple model of an aggregate macroeconomy. And I'm going to contrast this with a very simple Keynesian vision. Now, this is going to be in the context of a national economy. So this is, we're going to just, I mean, mostly national here. We're just going to think about one country for the minute. And the reason I want to do this contrast is that we have a model, and I'll show you. Here we go. We're going to have a production function. We're going to have, see if I can make the thing appear. Okay, we got a production function. There's our technology. Got labor demand, labor supply, and equilibrium. So we have nature or technology giving us what there is to work with. That's nature. Then people make their demand, the firms make their demand based on what? Well, the labor demand, that's the first derivative of the production function with respect to labor. That's a technologically determined wage. The labor demand, what's demanded is based on the productivity of labor according to that metric. Labor supply, in turn, comes from people who are preferring, in the classical thing, they're preferring labor or leisure. And then we put that together. And when we do that, we get an equilibrium. Now, the thing that I want you to see about this is that we get an equilibrium GDP, and we haven't even gotten to aggregate demand. There's no aggregate demand on the table. There's no consumer spending yet. There's no investment spending. Not here, not for this point in time equilibrium. This is all technologically and preference based. Now, the thing that we might mention is that if you are like George Osborne, David Cameron, people like that, conservative economists working their classical remedies, think about what they proposed in Britain to get out of their problems. They said, well, okay, we're going to cut the budget. I'll show you why we're going to cut the budget on the next page, maybe the next couple of pages. We're going to make the labor market more flexible. We're going to get rid of unnecessary rules and regulation. We're going to allow there to be a better labor market equilibrium, And if we, for example, have lower taxes, there might be more of a demand for labor. So that would be good. Or if you have lower taxes, you might have more of a demand, more of a supply of labor. What you're trying to do is to move this market. And then you want to encourage entrepreneurship, so you take taxes away, you cut government spending so that you can get innovation that basically is going to have the effect of moving up your production function. That's it. That's the entire focus of government policy. That's all they do, and people on the street say, you're cutting NHS, you're cutting the schools, you're cutting the universities, you're making our tuitions more. And basically, the conservatives were completely indifferent. It's not in their model. They don't care. In their heads, they're being completely, realistic. Now, let's see. I think I lost my... Let's do it this way. Oh, I see. Hold on. Okay, let's do it. Now it's going to work. There we go. Yeah. Okay. Now, basically, so if there's unemployment, the solution, so there's a picture of unemployment like back in the Great Depression. Of course, the famous solution this was Pigou, was to cut wages. Wages were too high. You're up at a level of wages that's too much. I'm sorry, my graphics don't match up there. The unemployment wage is too high. You want to get down to W star, cut the wage, then everything's going to be all right. So, to eliminate unemployment, cut wages. Now, the second part of the model, so basically that part of the model, you solve for Y, N, real wage, you solve for all those things. You already have your GNP, your GDP, already have your labor, already have your real wage. Now it's just a question of what happens to what you make. And here it's just a matter of market clearing. And for the market clearing, it's just a simple case of, well, you can use your income in different ways. You pay out your income as output as income. Income can be used for, let's see, well, it's going to be consumption, savings, or taxes. There is a demand for things. What do you buy? Well, there's you buy goods for consumption, you buy goods for investment purposes, or government demands goods. And we set this up as an equilibrium, and then we set up the kind of equilibrium condition in turn, and we get that basically investment plus any government deficit, G greater than T, must be financed by available savings. Okay, so that seems reasonable. And so this gives us the idea of loanable funds theory. And essentially, the loanable funds theory just says here that you take any savings you can and you logically put it where it's going to basically give you a higher return than money. So you buy bonds, you buy stocks, you buy financial assets that will give you return. And there's and basically we have the supply of bonds is coming over here from the funds, the firms that want to make investment, and then the demand for bonds is coming over here. This is from basically the demand should be shown there, that the higher the return, the more you demand. And basically the consumers are here. The consumers are either saving or they're consuming. And the more interest they can earn, the more they're going to save and the less they're going to consume. That's the idea. It's a trade-off. And it doesn't work well there. Sorry for the inaccurate labels. Basically, that's it. And then after that, you get your prices based on the level of money. So essentially, we have this equilibrium. And if in this world you increase government spending, what you're going to do is you're going to make things worse. Because if government needs to borrow money in this world, in this classical approach, government comes in there and they have this yellow amount. They have to take this borrowing. And they're going to take it out of the market, but the only savings available are the savings on consumers. So essentially you can see how the government just adds its demand to the top of, or on top here, and basically it squeezes down the amount of investment demand, and so the consequence is that the economy goes down. The economy, to make everything fit, the interest rate has to rise, there's going to be less investment, and everything will be worse. Economic growth is going to slow. So there's just that thing. Now, Keynes. So it's a little system. It's a system where basically government should stay out of the way, the market should be given room to work, keep taxes low, let technological innovation be strong, and everything's going to be all right. Now, Keynes comes in here and makes two big points. His first point is that aggregate demand is independent of aggregate supply. Supply creates its own demand. In the theory he's criticizing, you can see how you got, in the first stage of your model, it's a separable model, you got your equilibrium already. And you got that equilibrium just because it was there. You didn't worry about how were these goods going to be distributed. You knew that the price system was going to take care of that. The prices and the uses of this income, supply would create the demand to buy the supply. But basically, Keynes denies that. He says, no, you can have problems where there's not enough demand. Now, when you see like Lawrence Summers, now he's big time talking about global stagnation and the stagnation crisis leading to depression. He's actually referring to this kind of problem of inadequate aggregate demand. When the central bankers get together in Jackson Hole and they say, please, or when the IMF gets together, well, the IMF is like this, right? They're over here, and then they're over here, and then they go back, and please be disciplined. No, 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 government must spend. No, be disciplined. No, government must spend. But somehow, this demand that's coming forth from many voices, even mainstream voices now, some of them, is calling for more demand. We have a demand shortfall. That comes from Keynes's vision of the macroeconomy. His second big insight is that fundamental uncertainty is a problem, that basically our expectations depend on conventional beliefs. These beliefs depend on confidence, and these are all fragile. We don't know what's going to happen, and if we think we do, that belief can be shattered by events, and once it is, we pull back and we want security. So look at, for example, the case of Britain right now after Brexit. They're sitting there. What is going to happen? Nobody knows. If you were running any kind of company with an investment scheme, suppose you were running an automobile company in Britain and you sold, like, say, Rolls-Royce, and you sold cars to Europe. Are you going to be able to do that, or should you build your next factory in Europe itself because you're no longer part of Europe? You don't know. You don't know how it's going to work out. And so what you do is you withdraw, you hesitate, you pull out, you don't make the decision, because investment requires finance. Finance requires the commitment of resources that are at risk, and that puts you in the risk of loss. And if you fear loss and you don't know what's going to happen, you pull back. And that's where, trouble steps in, because once you pull back, then in Keynes's theory, then investment spending goes down. And investment spending is a component of aggregate demand. Spending as a whole goes down. Jobs go down, and the economy starts to collapse, very gently collapse, initially. So here's this is a kind of bad picture, but this is something like, let's go back to that world of, what did Pigou think should happen when there was unemployment? And, here he says, cut the wages. Well, what Keynes says is, the thing is, if you do that, if you cut the wages, what's going to happen is that there's going to be this sequence of events that isn't imagined by Pigou. What's going to happen is this. You're going to cut wages, and that's going to lead to basically less demand for labor. The less demand for labor is going to lead to less people spending money, and less investment. That's going to lead to less aggregate demand. And so what's going to happen is that demand for labor curve is going to come down, because that demand for labor is not just technologically determined, it's socially determined. It's determined by the logic of market structure, which is independent of and interacts with technology. So basically what you've just done, if you cut wages, so if you go like this, if you start here, let's say here, where's my trusty? Okay, here we go. If you start here, and then you're a good neoclassical and you cut wages down to here, what's going to happen is you're going to set in motion this chain of events that's going to lead to a destruction of aggregate demand that's going to force down the labor demand curve. Now, once you do that, what you've just done, as you can see, is we've just recreated our problem of too much labor, too little demand for labor. Unemployed people still, even after we thought we were hitting a target. We thought we were hitting the target, but we can't get there because there's this feedback effect through the aggregate demand process that's not in the model of the classicals. It's not there. So like every time in Britain, it drives me crazy as I'm a kind of Keynesian, I suppose. You know, these last years, Britain doesn't make the budget. We have a shortfall. Osborne comes in and says, oh yeah, the economy is really stagnant. We have a budget deficit. We need to cut government spending. So he cuts aggregate demand. And then the economy goes even more quiet. The demand for labor, everything goes down. And he sits there and says, okay, so it's worse, so we have to cut again. It's like, no. How long do you have to keep doing the same mistake before you, but see, that's why it's ideology. You can say, whose interest does he serve? You could say that. You could also say, is he blinded by an ideology, or is it both? And maybe it's a combination of both. So we have the other thing that Keynes does is he says, you know, it's crazy to think that there's just one place where people put their savings. It's not like that. It's not like there's the bond market, the loanable funds market, where every rational person puts every penny they have. So if you're not consuming, you're saving, and if you're saving, you're buying a financial instrument. That financial instrument is either supporting government spending, deficit spending, or it's supporting investment. That's the logic of the classical model, where basically it's never a problem. Either the goods produced are used in consumption, or they're used in investment, or they're bought by government, but somebody's going to buy it because the finance just pushes it right along the way. The savings is there to support all the things. But in this case, the savings may not be there because there's a move, a problem that Keynes recognized that's a consequence of this problem of uncertainty. And basically it's that the money market is not just a place where you hold a minimal amount of money because it's whatever you need for transactions. The contrast here is between, you know, a shorter term, you know, on the left, more liquid asset, and a longer term, less liquid asset. This may not exactly be money. It may be something that's more money-like. This might be the T-bill market versus the bond market. It's something like that. This is short-term versus long-term. But the point is that if you go short-term, if you go toward money, you will be safer. It will be easier to convert your wealth into money. And if you want to liquidate your position and get out of it and escape from your exposure to uncertainty, that's what you're going to need to do. Now, what Keynes shows is that, you know, so over here on the right is, you know, all this stuff, working capital finance, bonds and equity to finance investment. And basically there should be this margin. You know, basically there should be like a higher interest rate in the bond market because essentially that supports that, you know, you're taking a risk, you're taking your money and putting it into this less secure, more risky venture, so you get a reward for that. If you only hold money, if you go short term, you make a smaller rate of interest. That's your penalty for not investing or not saving in the other form. But here's how Keynes puts it. The habit of overlooking the relation of the rate of interest to hoarding may be part of the explanation why interest has usually been regarded as the reward for not spending, whereas in fact it is the reward of not hoarding. Okay, so it's basically interest is what you're paid for not hoarding. But hoarding, right, that's that thing. You hoard when you store up things. You're afraid. The animal goes and puts all its food in the cave and keeps it there so it has enough to make it through the winter. It hoards. And in this same sense, you hoard your spending power. You don't want to be exposed to danger. Look at how much cash there is in the world that's unclaimed. Look at the actual effect of quantitative easing as a monetary policy, the so-called monetary policy at the zero bound. We've got quantitative easing regimes throughout most of the advanced economies of the world right now. And it's been proven through research that almost half of the money that was created as basically the the central bank. So they go to the bank balance sheet, and on the bank balance sheet there's some paper, and there's some bonds, there's some mortgages, there's some other stuff, and they take that, and the bank removes it and gives them cash. Now the idea with cash, same name, both sides. It's good to have the same name, coming and going. But imagine this is cash now, and so we've now given the banks cash, and we say, okay, banks, be good banks, go and lend that money. But do they want to lend the money? No. Well, actually, first of all, who are they going to lend it to? There's corporations sitting, they've got no customers, they're closing their doors, their business is slow. You say, don't you want to invest? No. I don't want to invest because I don't have any robust business. Why should I invest? So the cash sits there. More than half of it. All we're doing is basically just giving these banks surplus cash. Now there's schemes. Now we're going to penalize the banks. They're all kind of crazy because, you know, where most of this cash can go is, well, let's see. The governments are suffering. The deficits are growing. There's more government debt. Oh, so let's use this cash, and let's take the cash, and let's buy government bonds. We do that. Government bonds. So the government can finance its deficit, and everybody's happy. Except there's still political pressure on the government. We're not really solving the problem. There's no investment. The banks aren't lending. The banks are just doing what the banks have done for many years in Brazil and in other countries we could think of. Let's see. Do we want to take a risk in this very dangerous emerging market? No. So what shall we do? Oh, I don't know. Let's go buy government debt, and we're going to borrow at, let's see, 2%, and we can lend at 10% or 8%. Nice. Nice margin. We're just part of the machine that keeps the government one step away from revolution or replacement or whatever it may be that the government's trying to deal with at the minute. Okay, now, back to Keynes. So in good times, you know, I mean, what this shows is the idea of, the idea of the red line here is the red is good times. Okay, so we started with the black, and then everybody gets fired up. And everybody puts the money into basically, you know, investment, and they pull their money out of savings, and the thing goes up, and we should see this kind of gap widen between the cost of money or the return on money and the return on investment. It's good times and so on. And basically, it looks like actually that's the smart move. Notice that in a period like this, if you just compare, if you will, this return over here, LT, long-term return 1 and 2, notice that if the movement of the market is up, or excuse me, of the return on investment is up, and financing investment, however you do it, then notice that if we're moving toward a speculative bubble, so more money is moving, more finance is there to buy the bubble asset, everything's going up, the returns are higher, and if you stay over here, just earning your small amount in the money market, you look like a sucker. You're a dummy. You're the one person who doesn't get it, that it's the new world order, it's the new economy, it's the new endless growth system, and we all have to get in. And notice that, you know, and then you eventually jump in, and of course once you do, and you buy that fabulous house, or you rent out that fabulous store for 120,000 pesos a month, oops, but that's another story. That's something, this boom and bust, you know, because then we see, you know, essentially, you know, once we have the flight to safety, then everything goes in the opposite direction. The flight to safety, right, is where the thing reverses, and the margins go down, there's a collapse, and there's a fleeing from risk. That's where we are now. Now, that's all in Keynes's theory. Minsky elaborates, but Keynes puts it there first. And so there is this awareness that government was needed to do several things. One was to make sure that we did not have a world where basically there was inadequate aggregate demand. We needed government to stabilize an economy where there was too little buying power and values were collapsing, jobs were collapsing, capital values were collapsing. It's a capitalist economy that's disappearing fast. The second thing is that the government must take action to ensure that there's confidence and stability in the financial markets, because this can just make the whole cycle crazier and worse with no solution. Now, back in those days, you had, of course, this is the Yalta meeting. There's Churchill, Roosevelt, and Stalin. And of course, there they are fighting World War II. Now, World War II is a great excuse to have hyper aggregate demand at a hyper cost, leading to the social destruction of Europe, the social destruction of the extermination of Jews, the hatred and vile activity all over the place. And this is something that, however, was a stimulus, and they all saw it. And of course, what's going to happen after that war is that this guy here is going to lead an effort to, have more domination of the Soviet system, which is going to give incentive to this part of the world to step up and make sure that their people are happy enough living under capitalism. That leads us then to the Bretton Woods system. There's a very interesting story. Russia, they tried to get Russia to participate in the Bretton Woods, and actually it ultimately did not. It withdrew. But they knew that that was, while they were allies in war, Russia did not want to play. And ironically, that led to probably the world of Bretton Woods as we know it. Now, part two then of today. What we have here is a situation in which we have this kind of system where there's a conflict between Harry Dexter White, very complicated guy. Oh, hold on a second. Oh, let's go backward this way then. That guy there, and there's Keynes. Basically, Keynes wants an idealistic system that's going to ensure that if there are problems of global imbalance, they'll be resolved by forcing or inducing the countries that have a surplus to stimulate more. White has another idea, which is that basically there should be a central governing body that resolves problems, and these bodies should be under the control of the United States. That is actually, and basically, Keynes wants something called a bancor, a currency that's owned in common. It turns out it was based on his experience both with the Indian currency system in the UK. It was based on his experience, let's say, in the Lend-Lease program of World War II, and then on some other experiments as they tried to finance this great war. Actually, but White has a different view. He wants the dollar to replace the pound. Keynes knows that the pound can no longer be the center of the global financial system, but he doesn't want to see the dollar. They fight over it, and basically, who wins? Well, here's the story of who wins. Okay, you saw this. He who's got the gold makes the rules. The United States wins. And basically, you see this is a story of the growing dominance of that United States economy, and they were in charge. Now, what Keynes wanted was that, as mentioned, the surplus nations would be forced to stimulate. There would be a globally issued currency, and basically with a global central bank, and essentially, if your nation was in surplus, that means, so you've got exports more than imports, you are going to be asked to stimulate your economy because essentially you are going to increase the level of demand for goods and services. That includes foreign goods. Foreign goods are imports. So as you stimulate, your X is going to be there from the rest of the world, but your M will become more until X minus M moves toward equality. So you balance upward. Now, that, however, that's what Keynes wants. That's not the system that's set up. Instead, we have the Bretton Woods system, which is this system in which essentially lots of the global economies are linked to the gold system, to the dollar, and the dollar in turn is linked to gold. It's not exactly a gold standard system, but it's gold standard-like. And the U.S. places its own currency in the heart of the global economic system. Now, this system is actually confidence-based. You know, the thing is that there's no global central bank, so there's a problem immediately of who can get the dollars. If you want to move in this system, you need dollars. You need to convert your currency into dollars, and that can be a problem. And in fact, the thing is that while the confidence in the dollar is based on the fact that the dollar is convertible into gold, the system depends on people not turning their currency into gold. Holding the dollars, knowing the dollar is as good as gold. So that's the kind of that's one of the critical flaws in this system that's going to bring it down. But there's another one too. We're going to get to that, and that's in the title of this section. No globally induced macro stimulus. Okay, so the U.S. comes out of the war. It's got 50% of global manufacturing. It's got a huge surplus on current account. That means that basically the U.S. has exports minus imports very positive. It means that there's no innocence. It's not like the United States saving Europe. And that's not that simple, but the fact that the dollars were there did help to recirculate global income, to use Varoufakis' phrase. And basically that in turn led to a situation where, stimulated by the conflict with the USSR, now no longer Russia, that there was, you know, the U.S. wanted successful allies. So this was a world where we had Keynesian budget policy, a welfare state, military conflicts, all kinds of things. But the contradiction is that the global economy as a whole is still operating with classical adjustment mechanisms. Why? Because of the mandate of the International Monetary Fund. So basically, you know, here's how it goes. The Bretton Woods system establishes these two main international financial institutions. There are others, but the two big ones are the IMF and the World Bank. Okay, now what are they? You know, we know this, but let's just take a look. The IMF is a US-dominated institution. It focused on short-term adjustments. So when countries come into problems, they're going to go to the IMF, and the IMF will help them resolve their problems. What are the problems? Well, you can't meet your international obligations. Why? Because your M is greater than your X. Your imports are more than your exports. You are not earning enough from abroad. So what's the IMF going to do? It's going to make a technical adjustment. It's going to help you technically to slow down your economy so that your M goes down, because your imports, that's what you control. Exports are for the rest of the world. I mean, there's more to it than that, but that's part of it. So you control your imports, you pull down your economy, you slow it down, the imports decline, and then basically the imports come down until they match your X, and then you're out of trouble. Surplus on current account. And so that's just what's going to happen. Now, the other situation is that this is a fund now. This is not a central bank. It depends for its resource on contributions from member nations. It cannot create infinite amounts of wealth or of money. And it's supposed to be led by a non-US citizen. Now, the other institution is the World Bank. Now, the World Bank is there to create to help to generate growth. That's the idea. So we have growth headquartered in the World Bank, and then we have the IMF helping the countries in trouble. So if you're in trouble, IMF. If you want to grow, World Bank. They should work together. Now, the only problem is that these institutions got captured by basically the same economics establishment that in turn was under the control of the US hegemonic power. Actually, if we do a Google map and we see the IMF here, 18th and our 19th and H Street, right there, there's a building. And let's see. Can you see the quote? Mm-hmm. They collapsed my country's economy, and now I must work 14 hours a day. So that was one solution. What a place. Okay, now you say, so they're making adjustments. So the World Bank should have some critical distance, right? except for the fact the World Bank is right next door. And just, again, the quotes tell you the whole story. Excellent cafeteria. So you know where to go. But basically,
they have Asian, they have Indian.
all of it.
Yes, it's incredible.
Very nice.
Yes.
Very nice. You must go there. Stay out of this building and go to that building. You know, and the thing is, but it gets captured by groupthink, and it gets captured by what? By the mainstream, higher level, U.S.-based economics departments who are turning toward classical economics, turning toward micro-based economics, turning away eventually from Keynesianism, and then so replacing the idea of a diversity of interest with a kind of groupthink that says we're in a classical world. Now, so essentially, the Bretton Woods system, the system in which all currencies are linked to the dollar is linked to gold, we trade that, we have the IMF there to help us if we're in trouble, and the World Bank to help us grow. That system has the same problems that the gold standard does. Now, you know, the gold standard, when you lose gold, you have to shrink your prices and your economy starts to collapse. But actually, this is not much different. The mechanisms are different, but it's the same effect. And basically, you have these problems where, you know, in the Bretton Woods system, you do have some dynamism. There's the recovery of Europe and Asia after the war. There's the emergence of Japan and Germany as regional powers. And that, you know, that leads to the United States. On the one hand, it's a stimulus for the global economy as the global economy is coming out of the war. But the implication is that the U.S. is turning from a surplus to a deficit nation. Now, that triggers the ultimate contradiction in this system because basically the system is based on the dollar being as good as gold. But suddenly you have a nation at the heart of that that's generating the dollars that is a deficit nation. And in the currency, in the language of the Bretton Woods system, with IMF and all that, deficit means weakness. And that's the United States there at the center. Now, basically, there are these struggles. Britain struggles, it can't make it. France pushes. France is very leery because France gets hurt badly in World War I. They go for the gold when they have a chance. They're not trusting much the other nations. They do the same thing in the 1960s. There's this American challenge talking about the way in which the overvalued dollar is being used to buy up French companies by U.S. multinationals. It's not fair. And so France starts to pull out of the system, and basically what starts to happen is that gold leaves the United States. Now you remember how that picture was before, and now look at it. Gold is flowing the other direction. Gold is leaving the U.S. systematically, and there's this loss of the belief that the dollar is as good as gold. Now, let's kind of skip the next part. I think this is something that you'll understand well. We basically, it's just true that for any spatial area, current account equals minus capital inflows plus increase in reserves. Basically, if you have a positive flow of goods that you're selling to other countries, if you're selling more to others than you're taking in, that means that you're going to have a current account surplus. And if you do, that means that you're going to have a capital outflow. You can either build up your reserves, which is what many developing countries have been doing in recent years as they've hit their primary surpluses, or you can go out and invest in the rest of the world. And then vice versa. If you have a deficit, you're going to have an inflow of capital from the rest of the world. So this is one of the few equations in macroeconomics that always works. And basically, the sum across nations equals 0. And basically, if every country in the world has a current account surplus, the final country must be in deficit. Now, and so there's just some math here. And let's just skip the math and go to this idea here. That basically, we have here, okay, so essentially, that here's your, exports minus imports equals the minus of foreign savings. Foreign savings is the capital, the flow of capital into your country. So if this is negative, foreign savings are positive. Foreigners are bringing money to your country. and then you can build up reserves or not. And then basically, if we link the GNP equation to the cross-border equation, we get this kind of overall equilibrium. Again, it's not an equilibrium in the sense of all supply equals all demand everywhere. It's just a relationship that's got to hold. And basically that any investment you have and any government deficit you have has to be funded in one of three ways. Either with your own people's savings, with foreigners' savings, or by spending down your reserves. That's it. Those are your only options. And every spatial area at every scale and every level of the economy has to solve this problem. This is not just a national problem, it's a regional, national, citywide, neighborhood-wide problem. And so basically, what the IMF does is when a country has a deficit on current account, it says, well, this is just a technical problem. You have a deficit on current account, you have to basically get your exports up, and basically, if global growth speeds up, that's good, but we have a system where there's no trigger, that surplus nations never have a reason to increase their aggregate demand. Germany is a winner of the game. You're not going to make Germany stimulate its economy. Why should they do that? They won. Scoreboard. They're done. They won the game. So you can't make them spend more. So the global growth is not going to speed up, so you've got to slow your growth down. And so this is just IMF technical assistance. Okay. Next part. We start to have, as we go into the Bretton Woods system, growing financial markets. We have the emergence of the efficient market hypothesis. The markets become freer and freer. There's theories of portfolio diversification. Basically, the large banks that are growing, they get more and more ambitious. They get more and more constrained. In World War II and in the Great Depression, great restraints were put on financial institutions to be more conservative, be more cautious. These constraints start to loosen, especially the big banks get rid of these constraints. And basically, there's a few financial crises that cause the governments to say, okay, big banks, you can have more freedom. And as they do, it leads to a situation in which we start to have financial instability. And that leads to a theory that was generated by Dymski about how financial instability can emerge from stability. And basically, what Minsky does is he's got this notion of what he calls the financial instability hypothesis. This is a kind of a difficult framework. It's comprehensive, but it's incomplete. What he does is he talks about how let's look at firms and let's look at banks as balance sheets. Let's look at the fact that everything has to be financed. All investment must be financed. And so let's look at the business cycle and look at the relationship between the businesses and households and other economic units that are all balance sheets as they move through the business cycles together, and what happens about that. And as he looks at that, we'll come up with a couple of details here. He comes up with the idea that, they're going to get in trouble. There's going to be the emergence of financial instability, and that's because he is a Keynesian, and the fact that expectations become euphoric. People think they're going to be too successful. They lose their caution. They get too adventurous. They get too much finance. And as they get too much finance, they eventually go too far, and the system's going to break down. He starts to worry about that and says, but what we can do is we can have a system in which we set up government apparatus. Big government can step in and solve the problem. Now, big government, he means, first of all, a lot of fiscal policy, countercyclical spending, and secondly, we're going to have big bank, central bank intervention to solve the problem. Okay, now he comes up with this way of talking about his model. It's called the two-price model. And what he has here is he imagines a firm. And he basically, has a firm where we've got assets, the firm has cash, equipment, buildings, and it finances its position with equity and with borrowing, short-term credit, long-term credit, all that. And basically, the problem of the firm is embodied in this equation right here. Basically, imagine what they have the firm is, imagine that the firm is going to invest in capital. So this is this, call it this right here, this K, durable equipment, buildings, and so on. So this is K. Now basically, the firm takes a position in K, and it has to finance K through this means. So it has to finance its position. And to finance its position, being very simple, let's just suppose that the debt D, they got to pay some amount R. So just to keep it really simple, they got to make this interest payment. They got to meet that payment no matter what. Now meanwhile, suppose that the uncertainty comes because they can either get one of two returns on their capital. They can get a higher price or they can get a lower price. Now the probability of the high price, capital P, the small price, lower P, well, it's just arbitrary, but imagine there's a probability of the one and a probability of the other. They add up to 1. And basically, what this means is that the firm is going to take a risk. It wants K. It can either make a lot of money and easily pay off its debt, or maybe not so much. And the firm has to assess how much risk it should take. And this is kind of the problematic that basically Dymski works with. He works with the idea of, well, you know, will the return from capital be more than the debt payments owed? How about, you know, if it's a high price or a low price? And so here's our K, here's our D. And basically, he imagines kind of 3 cases. And he calls this is his famous terminology of robust, fragile, and Ponzi financial units. You are a robust unit where basically, if you have a high return or a low return on your capital, you can always pay. However, if you finance more and you try to extend your market, you can become a fragile unit. Now, a fragile unit for Dymski means a unit where if you get a good return on capital, you can easily pay, but if you get a low return on your capital, then you won't be able to. Now, over time, if you're lucky, you know, things will balance out. Sometimes you'll have the high P, sometimes you have the low P. It'll work out. But the other possibility is that you reach a point where no matter what, even with a high price of capital, you've got too much debt. In fact, you've got so much debt you can't repay it. And you're going to have to borrow more even to pay the debt you already owe. You are called a Ponzi unit. It has to do with this guy, Charles Ponzi, who ripped off people long time ago. And now it's possible to look at this thing and say, well, these Ponzi units, they must be like basically like Bernie Madoff, just people that are stealing, that are just rip-off artists. But actually, you know, what Dymski shows is that no, you don't have to imagine that there's stupid people or there's people who are criminals. He says that this is just the logic of the business cycle. It goes from robust and calm, and people like it, and they invest more, and then they get more exposed, but they're driving that business cycle, and as they drive the cycle, they're becoming more fragile, and eventually the thing can slow down. He has the notion that we have this kind of foundation where basically as you borrow more, you're expecting it's going to cost you more. Here's the cost of your money. And then as you borrow more, the expected return goes less. And so as you go out to take advantage of more profits, what's happening is that you are, on the one hand, finding it you have to pay more for the money you get, and secondly, you're getting more riskier. And so that means that what's going to happen is you're extending your balance sheet. The idea here is simply that there's more borrowing and more capital down here. You're taking on more debt, and basically, the picture I need is this picture here, that eventually the thing's going to crash. And let's skip the two-price theory. I think it's not interesting. And so that's Dymski's story. The two-price, we have the price of capital and the price of investment. The notion is people look at the financial markets and they look at the real cost of capital and they compare. He makes too much out of that. He kind of follows Tobin. But basically, the key thing here is that we have a system in which banks play a central place, have a central role. Minsky used to say all economic units are banks, but basically banks, what do banks do? They emit deposits and they create credit. Now, in doing that, non-banks depend on banks for liquidity. So basically, banks have to have a way to find that liquidity. So banks have a key role. And then their tension can arise because banks have to be a place where you can always go to get liquidity, but it's also the place where you go and get you're sure that you can take care of, you're going to do your credit creation. Now, the more that the banks create credit, there's some tension with, will they always have the liquidity needed? Where's the liquidity coming from? And in today's age, for example, that becomes a super crazy, hyper-leveraged question on both sides of the big banks' balance sheets. But this is a tension that's there. On the one hand, they want to make the asset side loans and make money by either holding loans or selling securities based on loans, and then speculating on that, and they want to, at the same time, provide payment services. So the secret to getting out of any crisis is to fix the banks. Now, let's just say, okay, basically as the banks go along, see, here's what happens. The banks are there in the system, and as they go from the first phase, the robust phase, and then things go along, and the banks make more loans, so this loan portfolio grows. And as the loan portfolio grows, what starts to happen is the banks exceed their deposit base, and they got to get more dependent on money market borrowing. So they're more dependent on money market conditions. They're more exposed, and so they have both more default risk and more liquidity risk. The bank's liquidity risk is the risk that the funds that they've got to borrow are going to cost them more than what they're making on their portfolio of assets. The default risk is that the loans go bad. And so that's what happens. So essentially, there's these two pressure points in a Minsky cycle. Banks, on the one hand, should become reluctant to lend as their liquidity risk grows. So there should happen. The second point of tension is that the second pressure point is that when the banks are unable to provide liquidity, when the system breaks, the central bank has to be there to provide liquidity, renewing banks' ability to lend, renewing the pace of economic activity. Now, this central bank role is what Minsky calls big bank. And this is going to be supported. Why should the banks begin lending again? Because big government's going to step in. There's going to be counter-cyclical spending that will lead to basically more aggregate demand, and everything will stabilize again. Now, the price of economic stability in the Minsky world is you have to eat some inflation. Inflation is part of the mix. Okay, but basically what we have is the following in Minsky's world. Now, I'm emphasizing this because this is going to change. So we have that, okay, here's the elements. Banks are really leveraged. They're vulnerable to these risks. Government interventions are going to can focus on banks because they have the smallest equity cushions. If you rescue your banks, you can rescue your economy. Basically, essentially we have this situation where basically banks are the most leveraged units, and we have something like this. Here we have non-financial firms, households, and banks. And these are assets and liabilities. And you can see that, basically non-financial firms, typical firms have about 1/3 equity and 2/3 liabilities. Typical households, at least in the US case, have about maybe 80% liabilities, borrowing, and then 20% equity. But the banks are more like 10% equity, 90% liabilities. So the banks are the most exposed. So basically it means that central banks can intervene. Why? Because the banks are the most leveraged units. They undertake lots of the credit creation. They're the focus of liquidity risk. They have important borrower-lender relationships, and they can thus stimulate investment spending. Now, this is the world as Dymski knows it, and this is the world in which he said stabilizing the unstable economy is supposed to work this way. So basically, if there's a speculative asset bubble, banks are not the reason why. Banks are financing it, but banks are passive actors here. They're victims. And the bigger the banks, the more important it is in rescuing the system. Now, of course, I'm saying all of this because all of this is turned completely inside out in our day. Okay. Now, we're going to get back to that. But right now, we're going to get into the neoliberal era and what happened. Okay, so we start to have U.S. balance of payments problems in the 60s. Okay, there's the Vietnam War. The U.S. multinationals are acting like rentiers. The renewal of industrial growth elsewhere in the world turns the U.S. into a deficit nation. Now, the Fed tries to slow down the economy. The large banks fight them. It's not going well. In fact, it's not going so well that this proud nation imposes capital controls by 1963. In the middle of the so-called golden age of capitalism, the U.S. imposes capital controls. You can look it up. Why? Because they were trying to save the Bretton Woods system. And the problem was that because they were going into deficit, confidence in the dollar was declining. Credit crunches are coming. Credit crunches are situations where there's small financial crises, and they're crises of the dollar. And basically, the big banks are fighting to get out of the system. The whole model crashes and burns. Now, why does it do that? Well, it does that because basically what starts to happen is that the world is changing. You start to have, like Lucas and then Sargent and these prophets of the new classical economics coming in and pointing out that these old models don't work. And of course, what starts to happen here is that the old models are based, the econometrics are based on 1950s, 1960s data. When they look at the 70s, the models don't work. So we see the system finally break down in the 70s. President Nixon suspends the convertibility of the dollar. He tries wage price controls. It doesn't work. He finally ends the Bretton Woods system for good. So the golden age of U.S. hegemony is over by 1973. It lasts 25 years. The American century lasts 25 years. Now, that's a funny thing, though, right? Because what's the most powerful nation in the world today? Well, do we say the U.S.? Do we say China? That's a difficult question. It's a kind of strange question. So you say, okay, so if I say it ended in 1973, the Bretton Woods system ends. But what happens? Well, we enter a new phase, the neoliberal era. What happens? First of all, the 1970s are characterized by the revolts in the oil-producing areas. There are revolts of the producers. There are revolts that are geopolitical in nature. There is resistance in Iran, the overthrow of the Shah. There's a lot to be said there. But this is a chart of oil prices through the last, through this period of 35 years. And what you see is that in 1973, oil prices, which had been very low forever, more than quadruple. And then you go to 1978, and with the Iranian Revolution, they more than triple. So within one decade, an economy that never had supply-side constraints because there was always cheap oil suddenly faces very expensive, explosively expensive oil and shortfalls. Now, notice that since then, of course, the craziness continues as we look at the world of limits. But basically, what I want to show you here is that we have this situation where, inflation grows. There's you see the price inflation there, which is linked to, that price inflation is directly linked to these movements right here. There is your inflation bubble. Inflation is getting really bad. Profits are declining. So profits are declining in that time period. So we have rising oil prices, supply-side shocks, we have inflationary pressure, we have declining profits. So we have an economy that's out of control. Now there's a story, we're going to bring in next lecture the way in which emerging markets start to come into this. We're going to take that as the beginning topic for lecture 2 tomorrow. But what we want to see here is that at this point, the U.S. economy is completely out of control. In the 1970s, interest rates are going high, the banking system is breaking down, alternatives to banks are emerging, people are pulling their money out of banks. Here's the federal funds rate. The federal funds rate is the short-term interest rate, the shortest-term interest rate, the bank rate more or less. And notice that there are points where the short-term interest rate is higher than the long-term either mortgage or borrowing rates for corporations or for housing. The world is turning inside out. The high inflation is destroying the U.S. banking system, and the regulated banking system in particular is falling apart like a house of cards. And at that moment, we bring in Paul Volcker. Now, Paul Volcker is a man of experience. Paul Volcker, that mark right there, where we have the end of the Bretton Woods system, guess who was the president of the New York Federal Reserve in 1971 through 73? Paul Volcker. He was there. He made it happen. So Paul Volcker, he knows where the controls are. He knows how it works. And Volcker comes in, and basically he takes over this economy, and what's he going to do? The banks are breaking down. The economy's in stagnation. Inflation is out of control. The U.S. role in the global economy is rapidly declining. What's he going to do? Well, it turns out that he tells us. Now, if you've read Yanis Varoufakis' book, The Global Minotaur, you will have seen this phrase. Actually, I showed it to Yanis back in 2009. He really liked it, so he put it in his book. In winter 1979, so like February 1979, Volcker writes an essay while he is then still the president of the Federal Reserve Bank of New York. He writes an essay called The Political Economy of the Dollar. And he writes, "It is tempting to look at the market as an impartial arbiter." Now that's kind of like, okay, Milton Friedman, right? We can't have the gold standard, let's have market-based dollar, Friedman style. But balancing the requirements of a stable international system against the desirability of retaining freedom of action for national policy, a number of countries, including the U.S., opted for the latter, freedom of action for national policy. So then he writes, "A controlled disintegration in the world economy is a legitimate objective for the 1980s. Now he writes this down. You can look it up. He says this 7 months before he takes power in the Federal Reserve. This is the agenda, a controlled disintegration of the world economy. That's how we start the neoliberal era. So check it out. Okay, so there's the line where Volcker starts. Want to see what he does? Now remember what the Fed controls. The Fed specifically controls that blue line, the federal funds rate. Watch the blue line. Oh, just kills that economy. Now he plays monetarist. He plays, oh, I don't know, I'm just trying to control quantity. But actually, he's basically punishing that economy until he kills that inflation the old-fashioned way. This, of course, is what's going to give us the crisis in 1982 in Mexico. This is going to give us the collapse of commodity prices. This is going to give us a lot of things. And the collapse of commodity prices is the end of that phase of the emerging markets boom and the beginning of the restoration of American power. Not any more hegemonic power, but post-hegemonic power. With the Bretton Woods system, you have a hegemon that's in charge of the global system. With the neoliberal era, nobody's in charge of the global system, but the U.S. is the strongest player. It becomes the place where Eichengreen talks about the exorbitant privilege of the dollar. So it's post-hegemonic hegemonic hegemony. All right, now things go crazy. Let's just wrap up in a few minutes. I've got part 6 and part 7, if you remember. Maybe it's, I forget. Well, so the thing is, let's bring Dymski forward. Maybe this is the last part, I forget, we'll see. We have a few more pages left. Basically, Dymski is, he's writing his theory with this idea that, we can resolve crises of capitalism, because what Dymski is contrasting is the small government era of the pre-depression, where government's very small, the economy goes through these natural cycles, there's a lot of debt deflation, a lot of problems all the time, and then he contrasts that with big government capitalism, which is what he calls the capitalism of the, what Piketty calls the Trente Glorieuses, or, the golden age of capitalism. So he's comparing the 30s with the 60s. In the 80s, though, we're now in a different era. 1979, August, is when Volcker releases the Death Star. He hits that button and blows up the world economy. And there's no Han Solo around to go the other direction. So basically, so Dymski's always like, it didn't happen again. We didn't have a depression. He writes like a series of essays. Oh, it didn't happen again. There was no more depression. We're still in charge. And the thing is that, with Bob Poland, I started to look at this and to say, no, Dymski could really find no impediment to the sustained growth of the real sector of the economy. But when we look at things, it's more complicated. Okay, now we got some pictures to look at, and I got to explain these pictures. It's a little bit of work, but here's what's going on. So, take a business cycle and make the 0 year the year where the economy starts to go down. So the 0 year is the beginning of a recession. Okay, so we go from recession 0 through 1, 2, 3, 4. As far as we go, then we're going from the recession forward, and eventually we get to recovery. Now, what I then did is I went back to 1875, all annual data, to go back that far, and I picked up the small government era. Then I pick up the big government era, which is, that like 1930, the 30s through basically the end of the 70s, skipping the world wars and so on. And then we have 1981 cycle, 1990 cycle, and the year 2000 cycle. Okay, check it out. This first one is about GDP growth. Now, here's what Dymski's talking about. Dymski's saying that in the bad old days, when there was no big government, what happened was you had a recession, and basically the economy goes down hard. And it doesn't really recover, and it bounces back down, and it takes a long time for recovery. So it's really a bad scene. Now, by contrast, with the big government era, the economy goes down, but it almost stays neutral, and it quickly returns to growth. You are managing the situation. But now let's take a look at 1981, 87. You bounce down, and you go up quickly. Wow, what's that about? Okay, then you go down. Here's 1990. And you have these cycles, and you say, well, okay, so what's going on? Let's go further. Let's look at the unemployment rate. Well, okay, the small government era in red. This is the old days, 1930s, and before that, rather before the 1930s. What happens is the recession hits, and then unemployment goes high and gets higher and higher and higher, and people suffer for a long time. How about with the big government era? That's the black dotted line that Dymski celebrates. Well, look, basically what happens here is that unemployment starts to go up, but then it's under control. So controllo. But now here's the funny thing. Take a look at this. Look at 1981, 87. It stays high, it stays high, and eventually comes down. We see basically less and less responsiveness of unemployment to government intervention. Now, if we look at price inflation, it gets even stranger. Price inflation, okay, but so back in the day, prices would collapse, and then they would collapse more. That's the old days. That's the deflation, debt deflation. Now, the price, here's the Dymski era, the big government era, where basically, in exchange for the stabilizing unemployment and GDP, you take some inflation. There's your trade-off, between unemployment and inflation. But now look at the 1980s, the 90s, and the 2000s. There's no trade-off. In fact, there's no cyclical responsiveness of anything. Now, right when you start to think about the inflation targeting mandate of the central banks, look at this picture and think about inflation targeting. What the hell are they targeting? What is there to target? This is the global factory, right? This is the global factory. We're in a kind of post-inflation age in this sense. Now, you can get to inflation, but as far as the cyclical dynamic and what the central banks are worried about, that day is gone. Now, so we're going to end by just saying, I think this is the last slide, a couple of slides, just what's different about the neoliberal era. Okay, borrowing from Zizek, I think it is, welcome to the desert of the real. So what's special in this era? Well, we no longer have really big counter-cyclical fiscal expenditures. We no longer see that the crisis restores real wages and salaries. The crisis really doesn't do anything for the profit rate either. In other words, there's no quick fix. We're in a world where Dymski solutions, big government solutions, apparently don't work. Now, this is, right, so this is a different set of global circumstances, which leads the classicals, the new classicals, to say government is the problem. We have a dynamic, stochastic, general equilibrium model as our core model. It's a model from which government is absent because government can do nothing about this. Government is absent, so they take the clue that we're back in the world of Jevons, Volras, general equilibrium, just people, government, stay out of it, you can't help us. But of course it's more complicated than that, because what we have here is the financial sector feeding off the real sector all the way along. So here's a couple more things just to finish up. I think I've got like 3 and then we're done. This is a little bit more of these figures. I don't have small government figures, small government era figures for these. I only have big government. But here you go. So here's federal government spending. So this is U.S. All these figures, I'm afraid to say, U.S. figures. Basically, we have, after the recession, back in the golden age, big government spending really takes over, really gets high. They pump it up. Now let's look at 1981-87. Not exactly. Let's look at the 90s. Well, less. And let's look at the 2000s. Kind of less. There's less of that big explosive spending than there used to be. Now let's look at wages. Wages used to be stable in the big government era. But now look, every time there is a recession, wages go down. Now they might recover, but basically the momentum is down. And basically the further we go into the neoliberal era, the more down they go. People are losing and losing and losing. And profit rates too, basically were very stable and they get very unstable. So, I think this is the final slide. Yeah, it's just to say, this is not to say that Dymski's focus on financial instability is wrong or obsolete. No, to the contrary, this remains a defining feature of the neoliberal era. But how it works and how government and government's role in the economy plays out, and the role of it is really different. And we got to come to terms with that. And to do that, we've got to take a global view. We've got to bring in the emerging markets. We've got to bring in an overall picture of what's happening to this global situation. And this crisis, right, is rooted in a search for security. Basically, the U.S. current account deficit has existed since the 1980s. Now, I'll leave you with this thought. Actually, I'll leave you with a couple thoughts, but here's one. Think about that. Since the 1980s, the United States, the strongest economy in the world, maybe, sort of, has had a consistent current account deficit. That means what? That means, now I call it liquidity sink. I'm not sure if I'm going to get the world to like that phrase. What I mean is, that means that it has a chronic surplus on capital account. It absorbs credit, capital, funds from the rest of the world. That money has to go somewhere. What do you want to buy in the U.S.? Oh, I don't know. How about asset-backed securities? How about treasury bills? You know, keeps the government going, keeps everybody happy. So, you know, why do we then see Wall Street with the revolution of securitization? It's structural, right? It's structural. That is a phenomenon that's linked to the state of the global economy. It's not about geniuses in Wall Street, nor is it about, you know, these assholes in the Lehman Brothers, you know, making their deals. Those assholes are there making their money because the money is flowing in. The structure is there to support them. He was just reading, we were talking about Michael Lewis's book, Liar's Poker. And if you, there's even worse words in that book, I'm sorry. But basically, this is structural. And actually, when we want to talk about what's structural, who's voting for Donald Trump? Who voted against Brexit or for Brexit? Right? Frustrated working class people. They're tired. They're racist. They are insecure. They don't know what works. They don't know who to believe. They want somebody to blame. They're going to blame Mexicans. They're going to blame Peruvians. They're going to blame Brazilians. They're going to blame everybody in the world because, damn it, they're mad as hell and they can't take it anymore. And that is in part because of the breakdown of this government apparatus that Dymski believed could stabilize the unstable economy. It doesn't work anymore, and that's why we say we need a new global model. We'll do part 2 tomorrow, and now time for questions.
Okay, thank you very much, Gary. I think that's an excellent talk. A great lecture for our students, and I will put in the floor if you want to make some questions, algunas preguntas. You can,
No,
you understand Spanish, right?
Yeah, we can ask in either language.
So, si las pueden hacer en español, yo daría, a ver, vamos a hacer 3 preguntas únicamente, porque tenemos, esto va a continuar, continúa hoy a las 7 de la noche. Julio, ¿en dónde es a las 7 de la noche? Es, sí, ahí en el edificio del posgrado de la Facultad de Contaduría y Administración, y mañana aquí a las 12 continuamos también, o sea que vamos a tener 3 sesiones por la mañana y una conferencia hoy en la tarde, y después el miércoles también hay otra en el auditorio David Ibarra. Entonces es una secuencia, y yo los invito a que no solamente vengan el día de hoy, sino que veamos todo el panorama que nos está dando el profesor Gary, sobre todo porque esto en algún momento es parte de un libro que él está escribiendo. Entonces, sí, por favor, Noemi.
English easier for me. It's a little bit hard to hear also.
Ay, no sé si alguien nos ayuda con el micrófono, por favor, Valeria.
Would it be something equal to 1982? I was wondering. And the other one very short. After the 2008 crisis, somehow the capital market in the US boomed. Commodity prices, you found the commodities that they were booming, but it boomed. But it didn't have the same effect as before. Why? Yes.
I am very much impressed of your excellent conference. Congratulations. And I would like to ask you, I think, a simple question, because you are giving us facts and also economical thinking on the recent stories of capitalism worldwide scene. And I would like to ask you to give again the slide for ago about the dynamics, the synthesis you present us, and ask you how all these facts and this changing in the economic thinking is giving you a lead to a new model proposal, because facts are ongoing, theories are becoming something harder than ever we have seen in the history of capitalism. So some authors are speaking about post-capitalism and socialization of the economy, besides this monopoly strengthening of it. So congratulations again, and thank you very much.
Hello, thank you again. Thank you for the whole presentation. I am not an economist. I studied international relations, but I am really, really interested in the financial sector right now. So my question right now is, why does the financial sector is taking the lead right now? I know most of the time financial sector is always important in the economy, but my idea right now is that since the beginning of the neoliberal era, is taking the lead and is assuming a position that is overcoming or is taking the lead over several areas, like including agriculture, land. It is going beyond the normal areas of finances. It is going further, and I am really concerned about this area. So why does the financial sector needed to be in such a position that has to take over this a lot of sectors when the normal area was finances or the financial flows?
Yeah.
Thank you.
Okay, so 3 excellent questions, and it probably makes sense for me to talk about question 3 and then go to Noemi, and then we'll go to post-capitalism. So let's go like that. Okay, so why is the financial sector taking the lead? Actually, first of all, it really is the case. In the United States, the profits of the financial sector account for almost half of all industrial profits. And that same kind of ratio appears, let's say, in the UK. We have profits of about half of the UK profits are financial. And we even see this in, industrial giants like Germany. The financialization is more and more. And then the financial component of some of these companies is growing more as well, even when they are nominally non-financial. And so one thing I think we can go with, one thing that we should immediately mention would be the kind of analysis that we see by, let's say, my favorite book now of this in this area is by Wolfgang Streeck. He's got a book called Buying Time that actually Riccardo Bellafiore turned me on to that book. He's a Frankfurt School Marxian, and so he basically has this analysis that essentially what's happened here is that, with the destruction of the golden age of capitalism, the machines of accumulation that were built up, France and Germany and the US, went into crisis and began to break down. And actually, the contradiction, though, is that, there were many contradictions, but one important one was that the wages being paid in the developing world, whether it was the Mexican maquiladoras, or whether it was then China, or whether it was the tiger economies, or now Vietnam or Bangladesh, that these wages were insufficient to really, support global aggregate demand. You still were dependent, in some sense, by the fallacies of composition on the demand of the great consumer masses of the Western Europe, Japanese, U.S. hub. And basically, however, the wage growth was disappearing from there, and so what you had to do was to substitute borrowing and financialization for that. So the buying time he talks about is you're buying time because your system is broken, and you're extending the life of it. Now, of course, since he's a Habermashian, well, yeah, he's kind of with Habermas, but since he's a Frankfurt School, there's a very interesting discussion in his work about the way in which this undercuts consent, democratic consent for the government, and leads to part of the crisis that we ended with, the Trump crisis and the Cameron crisis, and let's say the Brazil crisis, and could we imagine a Mexico crisis? I think we could. And so there's the first thing. Now, why do they do it? This is actually the topic of the talk we're going to do tonight. Basically, there has been a battle for global dominance in the global financial system, and the leading firms have gotten bigger and bigger and more out of control. The creation of the shadow banking system, the creation, the very existence of more and more areas of crisis creates more profit opportunities that in some cases involve the payment of fees in exchange for insurance, like, in other cases involve zero-sum betting. But the markets are also asymmetrically structured, and my colleague Nina Kaltenbrunner, she looks a lot at the fact that the foreign exchange and the derivatives and other markets in Europe, in London, in the US are a lot more sophisticated, and there's many more instruments, and the speed of transaction is much faster than, let's say, in Mexico or in Sao Paulo or in other places, in Manila. And so there's this kind of extraction of surplus from the rest of the world through a domination of the levers of control of global capital, and within that there are zero-sum games being played, and the inside knowledge and this faster speed allows some to exploit others. In that book, The Big Short we were mentioning, one of the stories told is about how Goldman Sachs people were exploiting, the brokers were exploiting the Deutsche Bank buyers. Deutsche Bank was trying to be a global player, but they weren't quite global enough. And so there were games within games. And these games are unregulated. They're outside of any jurisdiction. And basically, this is a sector that is behind the, and this is something I think, we need to talk to Piketty again, because I was with Piketty in Ireland, and he was doing his talk about inequality, and I was doing my talk about global power and finance. And I said, look, Tomas, my analysis fits into yours. Where does that global 1% come from? It comes from there. It's obvious. but he doesn't want to say that. He's got a different kind of dialogue. We have to keep pushing him until he makes the connection. But those people, you know, you're in a 2% global economy at best, maybe 1%. Let's call it 2%. And your profit target and your hurdle rate of return is 12%, 15%, 20%. We'll talk about that tonight. It's systematic. But basically, really, that sector is going to grow 5 times faster than the rest of the world? It doesn't work. And it doesn't work. But it's the whole basis. That's one reason why Britain right now is so desperate. If you look at, okay, finance as a share, financial services as a share of exports, for the United States, 3% of all exports, or 4%, are financial services. It's higher by far than any other nation. Britain, 10%. City of London versus Wall Street. The old empire versus the new empire. You know, so it's there. Okay, so it's greed at heart. It's out of control greed, and they're all desperate, and they buy expensive cars, and they have their own debts, and then they divorce their wives, and they have high divorce payments, and they have many kids to send to fancy public schools or private schools. They have many expenses, and so our hearts bleed for the bankers. But actually, this is a lifestyle and a culture. I think it's partly a culture of competition that is insulated from any control and not yet really brought in. Now, Dymski. Now, this system, what are we trying to do here, right? Now, notice that, you know, something that I think we appreciate, you know, that one thing that's great about being in this audience and this with my colleagues here is that we're all, you know, monetary macro people, and we understand some things in common that, that sometimes we don't find. And one of those, if we just think with Marx for the minute, you know, with Marx, right, we have the story about, well, there's the accumulation of capital, and then you have to take profits, and there's the rate of exploitation, and we need to make profits out of the working person. We got to make those profits at the point of production. Okay. We give, you know, given, no problem. Okay, but let's just notice that there is also the M prime, you know, the M dash M prime, making money out of money. Now, basically, what's that? Okay, let's put it this way. Once you accumulate capital, then you've got the problem that the capital is there and you continue to want a rate of return. Now, that's kind of like Minsky's, you know, Wall Street price versus real economy price. You have to both, so as you move your economy into the future, your job is now a double job. It's not just to exploit labor. The other job is to make sure that the capital from the past, that, you know, the profits from the past embodied in this capital that's valued on the markets and so on, that it retains its value. So you have to balance maintaining the value of previously accumulated capital with continuing to accumulate capital in the present day and keeping all the workers happy all through the world so everything keeps going. I know it's impossible, but that's the task, right? That's the challenge. Now that's going to get to, we need a new model. But basically, that situation is one in which suddenly the interest rate becomes crucial. Because think about what happens if you own a piece of paper. So here's our bond. And this bond, let's suppose, we bought at 5%, just to pick a number. And so we bought the bond at 5%, and we paid, like, let's say, $100 for it. It's a $100 bond. And it's fine. We can buy it and sell it. Maybe it's very liquid, so on. No problem. Now, what happens if the interest rate goes down? Well, now our bond is worth more money because this thing pays 5. Now the market's at 3. If we want to sell this thing, we can get a capital gain. Nice. But how about if the market goes to 10? Now if we want to sell this thing, we've just taken a capital loss. We're going to have to sell at a discount. We're going to lose money on that capital. Now we get to quantitative easing and the Fed. The Fed's got a problem. They've got a few problems. First of all, they've been printing this money, as we were saying. they, not exactly, yeah, started printing the money. They basically, they say, give us your bonds, we'll give you the cash, here's reserves, lend the reserves. And then the banks are like, no, we won't. That's their first problem. They're not doing anything with it. But then the second problem is that while the Fed has taken a lot of bonds in its portfolio, there's still a lot of bonds in the market. And these are all bonds that have histories and pasts. They were emitted at certain interest rates. Now, if we raise the interest rate, it's a problem with that piece of paper. There's going to be a capital loss on that. And furthermore, so that's going to impact the bond markets and the money markets and anybody who's carrying paper through time that they have to mark to market in the context of rising interest rates. So that's one problem, is on one side, if you do that move, you're going to cause people to basically take losses in lots of places. However, if you don't raise interest rates, you're starving your pension systems of return. You're starving your banks of return on their normal assets. They aren't making any money. Now, they're not losing money, but they're not making money. They're not making loans. All they got is government debt, and government debt, if you read some of the work by, the hell's his name, Caballeros of MIT, he's got this work now where there's a shortage of global safe assets. Everybody wants global safe assets, but there's not enough, right? Because how do you buy your way out of this contradiction? You got to look for that magic paper, and there's not much of it. So everybody's looking for safety, nobody can find it. If we raise interest rates, basically argues some of the Fed governors, it will help the normal banks to make normal profits on normal loans, and they argue that the economy is strong enough to take that. But it will hurt the money center banks in other ways, and there's this kind of tension because the whole system isn't functioning in a normal way anymore. Nobody's lending and borrowing in normal ways, and those local banks are suffering, but the big banks, strangely, are suffering too. So that's it. Now, there's more to say, but let me stop there on that answer to your question. But let's go to the other question you asked, which is basically, after 2008, the commodity price boom comes up, but then it works out differently. And that's interesting. I think it goes for a couple of reasons. One is that there is a relationship between capital asset prices and commodity prices that's very unstable now. And basically, we saw the shale oil revolution, and for a while there, we saw the U.S. talking about energy independence, the strongest economy in the world with now the strongest energy independence. It's going to have its own dynamic. And actually, we saw the puncturing of the commodity price boom by the Saudis and other actions. Now, this actually leads to a question that I have. We can talk about it later. Why did that happen? I don't understand it. Was that the U.S. is losing control of the Middle East? So that basically they didn't want that dynamic. Was Obama and people and company, were they happy with high oil prices, shale oil boom, United States as independence, or did they see that as a recovery killer, and therefore did they make a quiet phone call to the Saudis and say, why don't we release some of these reserves and let's calm down these markets? Now notice that just as with quantitative easing, there's gains and losses on both sides. There's no way to make the whole thing work. There's global contradictions that are coming to roost here in the heart of the economy. Now let me get to again, there's more to say, but we talk later about these things. Let's now talk about post-capitalism. And first of all, you're right that my strange combination of facts, theories, and history is something that I've wrestled with for a long time. Basically, what are you talking about, Gary, is what I say to myself. when I was at USC, there was some strong, it was my first post, there were some very strong mathematical economists, and they proved a number of theorems at that point in time that really rocked me. One was, it's called the Folk theorem in game theory. If you know game theory, the Folk theorem is that there's always, if you have a sub-game perfect equilibrium, you know, something that could exist for one period, there always exists a rate of discount that will make, in an infinite horizon game, there's always a rate of discount that makes any sub-game perfect equilibrium a stable equilibrium for all time. Okay, right? Anything can happen in an infinite horizon game if you identify one. So you can play cooperation, you know, fight, cooperate, whatever. It can all persist. It depends on how things are valued. Second, there was an experiment done where these economists that were my colleagues, they took an Arrow-Debreu market, perfect set of complete markets, perfect scenario, every market for anything you could think of, and this is that version of the general equilibrium where you imagine that we all engage in planning. We're all thinking, what do we want? I want a haircut next Tuesday in Leeds at 11 in the morning at my favorite barber shop. I want an equilibrium price that allows me to compare that with the price of the fish and chips across the street 1 hour later. And so I can pre-contract for all that. And because we can all pre-contract, we know that in a general equilibrium, we can then implement plans given a price vector that allows all of us to maximize our utility. A beautiful picture. Unique equilibrium, right? That's the vision of general equilibrium. Everybody imagines a price vector and then implements plans that have the effect of giving us back precisely the same price vector that made us all happy. So it's perfect. We don't need any government or anything. Now, what my colleagues did was they simply removed one market arbitrarily. Pick a market. That haircut next Tuesday in Leeds. Take it out of there. Gone. The implication is that your equilibrium point becomes an equilibrium line. Infinite solution possibilities. And this actually underlies all these, it underlies all the asymmetric information models, all the models you can think of, all the complexity models. There's another theorem, you know, Sari's theorem. You can never discount the possibility that a time series of length n was not generated by a higher order equation, a chaotic equation of order n minus 1. You can never rule out deterministic chaos. So mathematics can never rule out anything. So it means that when we try to argue with models, it doesn't work. I use models to show the limits and the logic of thinking in particular contexts. Logic cannot carry my argument because all I'm doing is using these very fragile illustrative images to show how things sort of look. But they don't carry the argument. It's not that we're in that world. And when people say they are, even really smart people like Acharya and other people that are working, and Shin and Brunemeyer and other people that are working, let's say even in just the monetary macro area, they think of clever stuff, but none of it is really convincing. It's all infinite horizon, infinite equilibrium stuff. So basically, I think that we have to be historians. We have to pay attention to institutions. We inject ideas like power without really understanding them. As an economist, I can say power is when there's two parties in a transaction and whoever's on the short side of the market, whoever has fewer options, has less power than the one who has more options. But then we can put a frame around that and say, but what about the power of the dollar? What about the power of racism? What about the power of gender? All these things amplify and are not quantifiable. So I end up with a partly qualitative depiction of what's happening. It's not satisfying. Now, is that macroeconomics? I don't know. But now, we can't, now let's jump to post-capitalism, because you say, well, you got this crazy system, and you can't even, Dymski, you can't even describe it very coherently. You're telling a story, but there's other stories. I'll say, yes, there are. Read Giannis's book, for example, or read, read Streak. Like Giannis thinks we should save Europe. Giannis thinks that in the Eurozone. Streak thinks we should destroy the Eurozone. You know, so they come to really different conclusions with pretty similar analyses. Now the thing is that those are about these dynamics of power, conflict, resource, economy, all of this working through real time with a very imperfect ability to understand this. Now, post-capitalism is the idea that we're seeing the emergence of autonomous, self-organized methods of surviving that permit people to withdraw from the nexus of power. That bank doesn't have control over me. You know, I say something like, Dr. Alicia, can I have $5? She's my bank. She says, hell no, I'm done. I can't start my business. But if I go to Julio and say, Julio, can you crowdfund me? And, you know, let's get Noemi. Can you guys crowdfund me for my business? And now I've broken the bonds. I don't depend on her bank anymore. I'm independent. I've got my circle. So that's an image. And then we can think of chain method, you know, blockchain technologies for transactions. We can think of local currencies. We can think of other ways in which people are breaking out of the market system and in which, ironically, some of the super profits being earned right now are some of the most powerful companies, are companies that are operating with zero marginal cost technologies. You know, where basically, how much does it cost Google to put another person using the Google search engine? Oh, I don't know, nothing, right? And so arguments like that are used. There's a very important book, if you're interested in post-capitalism, by Paul Mason, it's just called Post-Capitalism, that makes the argument that essentially what citizens have to do is we have to use the state to break the monopoly of these companies whose monopoly power is the only reason why they continue to dominate the markets. This will liberate many, many new technologies, some of which are cooperative, some of which are zero marginal cost. And that will allow us to move back toward a world in which we can all have plenty and we can survive because technology and robots can be our friends, not our enemies, as long as we depend on each other and build chains of circular economies consistent with environmental sustainability and so on. Now, okay, I love it, and we have our own garden now, and we're growing even vegetables and God knows what. You never know what you're going to eat in my house now. But the thing is that, no, 'cause it could be a slug, you know, but but the problem is that I think that the international political economy dimension remains there. We have a world, we have the problem that Keynes could not resolve. We need the winners of the game to share with the losers of the game. Now that kind of happened in a twisted way when Uncle Sam, the United States, was trying to stay one step ahead of the Soviet Empire by making sure Europe had enough room that we had the Trente Glorieuses. It wasn't pretty, and there was a lot of social exclusion. You know, in my writing, I've talked about the racial exclusion that accompanied those days and was a kind of time bomb that eventually blew up the system. But is that dimension gone? Does Mason's logic give us a world in which those people can ignore the state or can reduce the state to a kind of Milton Friedman-like capitalism versus freedom vision of a limited function state? I don't see it, but I don't have a solution. Now, I've been talking to my friends at UNCTAD, Stephanie Blankenberg and so on. We're going to involve economists here, in Brazil, elsewhere, in what has to be a global rethinking of how do we do this. You know, in some sense, you go back to the 90s, and brilliant people like Ajit Singh, Ha-Joon Chang, and Richard Cosell Wright, other people were talking about the Asian model. And we've now reached like the end of the Asian model. So what's the next thing? We don't have a solution. We don't have a solution. So Mason doesn't have a solution for how his world of self-reproducing cycles is going to fit into the bigger world of geopolitics and power, nor do we know, if we accept the premise of unequal exchange across borders, how that can be organized, or who is the all-seeing, benevolent financial regulator that can stop all financial regulation on the global basis. We don't have the answers to those questions. They've been solved in the past only by the sequential periods of hegemonic power, with the price paid for the eventual exhaustion of the new powers that come along. But I think the first piece of wisdom we have about China is that China is not positioned to be the next global hegemon. They can't do it. They've got other problems. So arguably, the rise of China, which is still staying one step ahead of its own people's expectations, with a party apparatus that is corrupt, with an infrastructure-based expansion strategy that's obsolete, with housing bubbles and bank losses it doesn't want to declare, that China needs to solve its own problems. And perhaps if that China is in a world with more stable aggregate demand and government capacity and industrial policy in Africa, maybe we could imagine China helping to broker the way to the kind of deal that Keynes was just dreaming of. Now, is that nirvana? Are we out of the system? Hell no. You know, we're still in this thing where we can't close our eyes and fully withdraw. I don't think we have the option. And so it's a kind of funny place. You know, if you remember, some of you remember, there was a moment, I was like too young for this, probably, you know, where like our older brothers and sisters and people who are older, they were becoming hippies and they went off to communes. And right, and now, you know, live the dream, right? Smoke a lot of dope, go out into the country, just sit back and forget about everything and raise your vegetables and make the world go away. Now, that was like one dream, and now we're all back in this crazy world trying to think about all this stuff and working with power brokers who are ruthless. But one thing I know, like, if I can, that things are somehow changing. I'm leading this crusade, as I mentioned at the beginning, of these left economists in Britain. We probably will not win a chance to rethink macro policy, even side by side with the mainstream power people. It's a long story. We'll drink a pint and I'll explain all the things that happened. But what I do know is that this group of idealistic macro, you know, Keynesian, Kaleckian, Marxian, institutionalist, feminist people that I put together, this group has some big ideas. We're talking about macro policy has to deal with sustainability. Macro policy got to deal with inequality. Macro policy got to deal with industrial strategy. Macro policy's got to deal with regional difference and urban issues and gender and so on. And so that's in our proposal. And I basically, this morning, wrote 2 letters. Actually, I wrote 4, but I got responses so far to 2. The letters basically said, okay, dear Mr. and Mrs. Influential Macroeconomist in the US, the British have this call for proposals to rethink macro. All they're going to do is they're going to figure out how to hyper-optimize something that will let them believe they can predict the next financial crisis. And they'll just attach that to their regular macro policy, and they're done. That's all they want. They've been in control, they're in control. It's the Treasury, it's the Bank of England. They're not that interested. They're not that imaginative. They just want to keep control because they're boring macro people in charge of places like Oxford and Warwick and the London School of Economics. However, there's this other group that's thinking these things, and it's really thinking about what you can do with the money. What is infrastructure for? Well, how do you think about sustainability? And the letter concludes, it says, well, the thing is that the first group doesn't, they know they need fiscal policy, but it doesn't come out of their model, and they have no idea what they'd spend it for because they don't think about that in their models. The second group knows what you would use the money for, but they don't have the ability to influence the policymakers. Between those falls any appeal of the IMF or anybody who talks about we need more fiscal spending, we need to get out of global austerity, governments can't you spend more. The people who control macro have forgotten why they would do that. The people who don't control macro do know why you would do that. You do that so you can have a gender-based equality that's better. You could have child care that's reasonable, etc. You could do things, but that group has no power. So basically, I need some power brokers to come in and help advise my project so we can bring these people together. And so I wrote to Ellen Blander. I just finished that letter as she drove up to the door. I wrote to Adam Posen, who runs the Peterson Institute for International Economics. I finished that just before you came to the door as well, so I don't know what they said. The other two letters I wrote were to Brad DeLong and Lawrence Summers. I got answers saying yes within 5 minutes. Now, these are people who could afford to ignore the existence of people like us for many dozens of years. This is the man who said that more garbage should be sent to Mexico. This is the man who said women aren't smart enough to be scientists. Now see, there you go. Will I make him my ally? It's politics, right? Do we want the world to change? We got to engage in the politics. We got to get the people at the Bank of England and at the Treasury and at your Treasury, these idiots who run the Mexican economy or don't run it. We need these people to change their thinking, and they're going to change it thinking they're good little soldiers, just doing the right thing. They're just doing the models everyone's doing. And if Lawrence Summers and Brad DeLong can convince some of these Chicago people that, oh, this is a new thing we all have to do, they'll do it. They won't even know why, maybe. But are you going to go to the Treasury and systematically, or the central bank, and systematically shoot every PhD economist? That's what it's going to take, and if you want to go that direction. So if you don't shoot their bodies, you have to pollute their minds. And to do that, we need a lever. We need to figure out a way to change thinking. So that's part of the new model. We need the new real model, then the new way we say the model, and this is going to include people who think economics is a science, even including it's going to be done by people who know it's not. And that's the problem we got to solve. Now, I don't feel strong enough to solve that problem myself. And I don't know if there's a John Maynard Keynes or a Karl Marx sitting out there amongst you. I hope so. Because, but my thought is at least we're going to get to the right questions and set it up and get real about it. And then let's go from there.
Okay. Bien, pues muchísimas gracias, Gary. Y bueno, con este fin de buscar el nuevo modelo, pues los invito para que en unas cuantas horas nos veamos aquí en el posgrado de la Facultad de Contaduría y Administración, y mañana nos vemos aquí a las 12 en punto para seguir con esta plática tan very excited, con mucha vida, y bueno, aquí los esperamos. Muchísimas gracias. Okay.